You end the day exhausted, and somehow still feel behind. That's the strange part. You're doing things constantly, answering messages, watching productivity videos, planning, replanning, organizing your life like it's one perfect routine away from finally clicking into place. But deep down, there's this quiet feeling you can't shake. Nothing important is actually moving, and maybe you've started calling that burnout. Maybe you tell yourself life is overwhelming right now. Maybe you think you need more time. But what if the real problem is harder to admit? What if you've become addicted to feeling productive instead of becoming productive? Because those are not the same thing. You can spend an entire day busy and still avoid the one thing that would actually change your life. That's what makes this trap so dangerous. It doesn't look like self-destruction. It looks responsible. You wake up already mentally crowded. Before your feet touch the floor, your brain is scanning unfinished tasks, emails, notifications, tiny anxieties, half-built plans. You grab your phone for 2 minutes and somehow lose 25. Then the day begins. You move fast, but not forward. And at first, this feels harmless. You tell yourself you're preparing, researching, thinking carefully, trying to get clarity before taking action. But here's what nobody realizes. Confused people love motion, because motion feels safer than commitment. If you stay busy enough, you never have to confront the terrifying possibility that focused effort might reveal how scared you actually are. That's when the real problem begins. You stop measuring progress by outcomes. You start measuring it by activity. And once that happens, your brain quietly rewards distraction. Not obvious distraction. Productive distraction. Color-coded plans, new systems, another podcast, another fresh start on Monday. 5 tabs open, 3 unfinished goals, a notebook full of intentions, no real movement. You know what this looks like? Opening your laptop to work, then reorganizing your desktop for 30 minutes because somehow that suddenly feels urgent. Watching videos about discipline instead of doing the uncomfortable thing requiring discipline, convincing yourself you're working on yourself while avoiding every action that could actually change something. And the uncomfortable truth? Your brain probably prefers it this way, because real progress is emotionally expensive. It demands uncertainty. Busy work doesn't. Busy work gives you the emotional reward of effort without the emotional risk of failure. That's why some people stay stuck for years while feeling exhausted the entire time. Not lazy, not incapable, distracted by disguised avoidance. But the strange part is, most people never notice this happening, because the world praises busyness constantly. If you look stressed, people assume you're ambitious. If your schedule is full, people assume you matter. If you're always occupied, nobody questions whether your life is actually moving anywhere meaningful, including you. And this changes everything. Because eventually you stop asking, is this helping me grow? You start asking, how do I survive another week? That shift is subtle, but dangerous. Now your life becomes maintenance instead of direction. You respond instead of create. You consume instead of build. You stay mentally stimulated enough to avoid silence, because silence might force you to confront the truth. You're running hard without knowing where you're going, and maybe that line hit a little too hard, and that sentence sounds reasonable for a while. I'll start when things calm down, when I'm more focused, when I have a better plan. But life has a brutal habit of moving while you prepare for it. That's the part people notice too late. You don't suddenly wake up one day completely lost. You drift there quietly. One delayed conversation. One postponed decision. One more week of thinking about it. One more month spent consuming instead of creating. And because nothing explodes immediately, your brain assumes the delay is harmless. But the cost isn't visible at first. It accumulates internally. You begin doubting yourself in small ways, not because you failed, because you stopped trusting your own word. Every promise you quietly break with yourself leaves a mark. You say you'll wake up earlier, you don't. You say you'll start the project. You avoid it. You say tonight will be different. Then somehow it becomes 1:17 a.m., and you're still scrolling through strangers' living lives you secretly wish felt possible for you too. And this is where things start falling apart. Because confidence isn't destroyed dramatically, it erodes through repeated self-abandonment. That's why busy people often feel strangely empty. They're constantly active, but rarely aligned. And deep down they know it. You can feel when your energy is being spent instead of invested. There's a difference. One leaves you fulfilled. The other leaves you overstimulated and strangely disconnected from yourself. You know that feeling when you finish an entire day and can't explain where it went. That's not always poor time management. Sometimes it's emotional avoidance stretched across 12 hours. Because focused workforce is clarity. And clarity can be uncomfortable. If you finally sit alone with the thing you've been avoiding, the business idea, the career shift, the difficult conversation, the creative project, the change you know you need, then there's nowhere left to hide. Now the outcome matters. Now your identity feels involved. That's why people unconsciously stay busy with smaller tasks. Tiny accomplishments feel emotionally safer than meaningful progress. Answering emails feels easier than confronting your future. Cleaning your room feels easier than rebuilding your life. Research feels easier than commitment. And look, some preparation matters. But there's a moment where preparation becomes procrastination with better branding. That's the moment most people miss. You don't need more information nearly as often as you think. You need tolerance for discomfort. Because the people who actually move forward are rarely the people who feel most ready. They're the people willing to act while still uncertain. And that idea irritates people at first, because uncertainty feels unfair. You want guarantees before effort. You want clarity before movement. You want confidence before action. But life almost never works in that order. Action creates clarity. Not the other way around. And this changes something important, because suddenly you stop waiting for the perfect emotional state to begin. You realize motivation is unreliable because emotions are unreliable. Some mornings you'll feel focused. Other mornings your mind will feel heavy for no obvious reason. That doesn't mean your direction disappeared. It means you're human. But here's where people accidentally trap themselves again. They confuse intensity with progress. Big emotional moments, massive resets, dramatic promises. This time everything changes. Usually at night, usually after feeling guilty long enough. Then a few days later the energy fades, and they assume they failed again. But real growth is rarely dramatic. Honestly, it's kind of boring. Not empty boring, quiet boring. Repeating small actions long enough for your identity to catch up. That's why meaningful lives often look unimpressive day to day. A writer writing before inspiration arrives, someone going to the gym without posting about it, a person slowly rebuilding trust in themselves through ordinary decisions nobody else notices. No cinematic transformation, just consistency. And weirdly enough, that's what makes it powerful. Because eventually your brain starts believing your actions more than your intentions. That's when self-respect begins returning, not when you think differently. When you behave differently repeatedly. And maybe this is the part you needed to hear. You are not failing because you're incapable. You're exhausted because your attention is scattered across too many meaningless directions. Your mind has become crowded. Not weak, there's a difference. And once you see that, you start protecting your focus differently. You become more careful about what consumes your energy. You stop glorifying being constantly available. You stop mistaking stimulation for fulfillment. You stop building a life entirely around reacting, because reaction keeps you busy. Direction moves you forward, and maybe for the first time in a while, you start noticing the difference. The silence feels less threatening. The important task becomes clearer. Not easier. Clearer. You begin understanding that progress often feels uncomfortable, repetitive, and emotionally unimpressive in the beginning. That's normal. The problem was never that you weren't capable of change. The problem was that distraction became your emotional hiding place. And honestly, most people never realize that. They stay trapped in motion forever, always planning, always restarting, always almost ready. Meanwhile, their life keeps moving without them. But now you've seen it, which means pretending not to notice becomes harder. And maybe that's a good thing, because awareness changes behavior quietly. Not instantly. Quietly. Maybe tomorrow you still wake up anxious. Maybe your mind still reaches for distraction, automatically. But now there's a pause before it happens, a moment where you recognize the pattern, and sometimes that moment changes everything. Not because your life suddenly becomes easy, because you finally stop confusing movement with meaning. If this felt a little too real, maybe that's the part you shouldn't ignore.